It happened last Thursday while organizing the attic. Emma and I had always intended to clear it out, but like most tasks, it had been pushed aside for years. The space was filled with random boxes, some with yellowing labels. Among them was one marked Emma, private, 1998 to 2005. Curiosity got the better of me. The box was dusty and sealed with brittle tape that gave way too easily. Inside were notebooks, photo albums, and at the bottom, a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. I could immediately tell they weren't the casual kind you'd send to a pen pal. The handwriting was firm and distinct, definitely not Emma's. The first letter was dated 2004. The opening line made my stomach drop. "My love, the way you look at him, I can't pretend it doesn't hurt, but we know why it's necessary." I flipped through the letters, scanning for context, and the same name appeared repeatedly. David. Yes, David, my best friend, the man who had been part of my life for decades. But the real blow came in one letter dated the year my son, Jack, was born. I can't believe he doesn't suspect a thing. I'll play the role of the happy wife, but seeing Jack's face every day reminds me of our passion. He's yours, not his, and that will always be our secret. The words blurred in front of me, rage and disbelief flooding my system. Jack, not mine? My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, unsure who to confront first. Emma, David, or both. This wasn't just betrayal. This was my entire life appended. Life in our household followed a predictable rhythm, one I'd grown comfortable in over the years. My wife, Emma, was the cornerstone of our family. She was 41, always on top of the kids' schedules, the house, and even the occasional bake sale. Our son Jack, 16, and our daughter Sophie, 13, were as different as night and day. Jack was a calm, level-headed teenager who spent most of his time either studying or practicing soccer. Sophie, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of energy, her life a blur of dance classes, art projects, and social events. Most mornings were chaotic, but in that endearing way you learn to love. I'd wake up early to make coffee while Emma prepared breakfast, calling up the stairs for Jack and Sophie to hurry before the bus arrived. Jack was always the first one down, grabbing his cereal with a quick "morning, Dad," before diving into his phone. Sophie would appear 10 minutes later, hair half-brushed, complaining about how Jack had hogged the bathroom again. Emma would roll her eyes, kiss me on the cheek, and hand me my travel mug before I left for work. Evenings were my favorite part of the day. We'd sit together at the dinner table, Emma's lasagna or roast chicken a welcome change from my rushed lunches at the office. Jack would tell us about practice or some new strategy he'd learned from his coach, while Sophie would wave her hands enthusiastically, recounting some wild story from her day. Afterward, Emma and I would clean up while the kids finished their homework or retreated to their rooms. I couldn't have asked for more. Jack was a reflection of the best parts of me. I thought responsible, driven kind. We shared the same taste in music, the same crooked grin, the same way of scrunching our brows when deep in thought. I'd taken him fishing every summer since he was 5, and I'd been looking forward to teaching him how to drive in the coming months. As for Sophie, she had Emma's energy, her quick wit, her penchant for solving problems with creative flair. Never, not once in 16 years, did I suspect that my role in Jack's life was anything less than what it appeared to be. He was my son, in every sense of the word. The idea that he might not be, that someone else's blood might run through his veins, it was so absurd, so unthinkable, that when I found those letters in the attic, my brain refused to process it. How could Emma, who had always been so devoted, so steadfast, have hidden something so monumental? How could Jack, who looked up to me with such trust, not be mine? How could the life I'd built so carefully be founded on a lie? I sat in the attic for what felt like hours, the bundle of letters trembling in my hands. The air was thick with dust, but it might as well have been my own disbelief choking me. Emma had always been the glue of our family, her love, her energy, her dedication to the kids. She wasn't just my wife. She was the bedrock of everything I thought I knew. But now I couldn't look at her without imagining those words. He's yours, not his. Jack, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, who'd fallen asleep on my chest as a toddler during football games, wasn't mine. My hands balled into fists, crushing the fragile paper of the letter. Eventually, I dragged myself back downstairs, shoving the letters into my jacket pocket. The house was quiet, Emma humming softly to herself in the kitchen. The scent of roast chicken filled the air. It was Sophie's favorite. Jack was sprawled out on the couch in the living room, scrolling on his phone. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug, doodling on a pad of paper. "Hey, Dad," Sophie said, flashing me her gap-toothed grin. "Look, I made a comic about that weird alien story we talked about." She waved the sketchbook in my direction. I forced a smile. "That's great, sweetheart," I said, ruffling her hair. Jack glanced up and nodded at me. "Hey, Dad," he said simply before returning to his phone. How normal it all felt. How completely and utterly normal. If I hadn't opened that damn box, I never would have guessed. Dinner was uneventful. Emma served the food, and we all sat together, laughing at Sophie's silly stories and Jack's sarcastic jabs at her. I sat there, watching them like an outsider, trying to find cracks in the illusion. Every time I glanced at Jack, I felt a pang of guilt. Did he know? Had he ever questioned anything? His mannerisms, his interests, they all mirrored mine. Or had I just convinced myself they did? After the kids finished and cleared the table, Emma stayed behind to pour us each a glass of wine. She leaned in close, her familiar perfume wrapping around me. "You've been quiet," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "Everything okay?" The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. Instead, I shook my head, forcing a neutral tone. "Just tired from sorting through the attic." She smiled, brushing my arm. "You've been meaning to do that for years." "Find anything interesting?" "Not much," I lied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. But I couldn't stay calm for long. The weight of the letters burned in my pocket like a brand, daring me to confront her. My heart raced as I sat on the couch later that night, pretending to watch TV while Emma folded laundry nearby. I knew I couldn't let this sit for long. But how do you bring up something like that? "Hey, honey, by the way, I found some letters that say Jack's not my son. Care to explain?" Every possible way I thought of phrasing it sounded ridiculous. I needed proof. Real proof. Something more concrete than words on a page. Something that left no room for denial. I went to bed that night, barely able to sleep, knowing what my next step had to be. I needed to know for sure. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. My mind had been churning all night, running through scenarios, but one thing was clear. I needed undeniable proof before confronting Emma. Accusing her without something concrete felt reckless. The kitchen smelled of coffee when I came downstairs. Emma was leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone, dressed in her usual leggings and sweater, her hair tied up messily. She looked so natural, so relaxed, that it almost made me doubt what I'd found. "Morning," she said, flashing me a smile. "I left you some coffee." "Thanks," I mumbled, pouring myself a mug and taking a sip. Jack's footsteps thudded on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. "Morning," he said, grabbing a banana from the counter. "Soccer practice after school today?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Yeah," he replied, peeling the banana. "Coach says we need to work on defense. We've been letting in too many easy goals." I nodded. "You'll nail it. You always do." He grinned and stuffed the rest of the banana into his mouth. "See you later." I watched him leave, my chest tightening. What if this was my last day believing he was mine? I kissed Sophie on the top of her head as she worked on her homework at the kitchen table, then excused myself to run errands. Emma barely noticed as she flipped through a recipe book. My first stop was the pharmacy, where I picked up a home DNA test kit. The cashier, a young woman in her early 20s, barely glanced at me as she scanned the box. To her, it was just another transaction. To me, it was the first step in unraveling my life. Back home, I waited until everyone was occupied. Emma in the garden and Sophie glued to a TV show. Jack's soccer jersey from the last game was still in the laundry basket, its collar damp with sweat. I grabbed it and carefully sealed it in the collection bag from the test kit. Now I just needed my own sample. I swabbed the inside of my cheek, feeling like a criminal wiping away evidence. The kit instructions were clear. Seal both samples, fill out the form, and mail it to the lab. The results would take up to a week. I shoved the envelope into my jacket pocket, my heart pounding as I walked out to the mailbox. Dropping it inside felt like crossing some invisible line, one I could never uncross. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work to avoid the gnawing anxiety. At home, I tried to act normal, but every moment with Jack felt heavier. When he told me about his latest school project or asked for help fixing a squeaky bike wheel, I couldn't stop wondering, is he really mine? Emma seemed to notice my mood. You've been distracted lately, she said one night as we lay in bed. Just work? I replied, turning over to avoid her gaze. She sighed softly, but didn't press further. Every passing day felt like an eternity. Finally, the email arrived. I sat in my car in the office parking lot, the engine still running, as I opened it. The words stared back at me, cold and clinical. Probability of paternity, 0%. The air left my lungs. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Jack wasn't my son. The letters hadn't lied. And now, there was no denying it. Emma had been keeping this from me for 16 years. It was time to confront her. That evening, I arrived home just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway. My chest was tight, and the dam of emotions I'd been holding back all week threatened to break. The proof was there, undeniable, and there was no more room for excuses or hesitation. Inside, the house buzzed with its usual rhythm. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the couch, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, while Jack stood in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge. Emma was chopping vegetables at the counter, humming quietly. The scene was idyllic, domestic perfection, like something out of a commercial. I couldn't take it. Emma, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She looked up startled. What's wrong? We need to talk. Alone. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern. Okay, she said carefully, setting the knife down and wiping her hands on a towel. Let's go to the living room. No, my voice came out sharper than intended. Our bedroom. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for a clue, but I didn't give her one. Finally, she nodded and followed me up the stairs. My heart pounded with every step. Once we were inside the bedroom, I closed the door and turned to face her. Emma crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. What's this about? She asked, her tone cautious. I pulled the letters from my jacket pocket and dropped them on the bed. For a moment, she just stared at them, her face pale. Then, slowly, she reached for the bundle, her hands trembling. Where did you get these? They were in the attic, I said coldly, hidden in one of your old boxes. She flipped through the first few pages, her breathing shallow. I can explain, she stammered. Explain what, Emma? I snapped. That you've been lying to me for 16 years? That Jack isn't my son? That the boy I've raised, the boy I've loved, is the result of your affair? Her head jerked up, her eyes wide with panic. Don't. I interrupted, holding up a hand. Don't you dare tell me it's not true. I had a DNA test done, Emma. 0%. 0. He's not mine. The room fell silent. Emma sank onto the edge of the bed, the letters still clutched in her hands. Tears filled her eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. I never meant for you to find out, she whispered. I laughed bitterly. That's your defense? That you wanted to keep me in the dark? I didn't want to ruin everything, she sobbed. You're his father, no matter what those tests say. You've been there for him every step of the way. You've been a better father than David ever could have been. Hearing David's name made my blood boil. David? My best friend? You betrayed me with him, Emma, and you let me believe Jack was mine. For 16 years. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. It was a mistake. A stupid, horrible mistake. But I didn't know how to tell you. And by the time I realized I was pregnant, I couldn't. You couldn't. My voice rose, anger bubbling over. You couldn't even give me the choice? You just decided to trap me in your lie. I wasn't trying to trap you, she cried. I thought if I loved you enough, if I worked hard enough, it wouldn't matter. But it does matter, I shouted. It matters more than anything. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made us both freeze. Is everything okay? Jack's voice called through the door. Emma and I stared at each other, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Finally, I forced myself to respond, my voice strained. We're fine, Jack. Go back downstairs. There was a pause, then his footsteps retreated. I turned back to Emma, my voice low but seething. This isn't over. But for his sake, for Sophie's sake, we'll keep it together. At least until I figure out what happens next. Emma nodded silently, her face streaked with tears. I walked out of the room, my mind racing. This wasn't just about me and Emma anymore. It was about Jack, Sophie, and the life I thought I'd built. And now, I had to decide if I could keep it all from falling apart. The next morning was unbearable. Every glance exchanged with Emma felt like a knife's edge. We moved around each other in silence, the weight of the confrontation hanging over us. She looked drained, her eyes red and swollen from crying through the night. I barely slept at all. Downstairs, Jack and Sophie were eating breakfast, oblivious to the storm brewing under their roof. Jack gave me his usual morning nod, while Sophie babbled excitedly about a project she was working on at school. I sat at the table, pretending to sip my coffee, but my mind was elsewhere. My eyes kept drifting to Jack. Every word he said, every movement he made, it all felt like a cruel joke. For 16 years, I believed he was mine, and now I was left questioning everything. Was it just coincidence that he loved soccer like I had as a kid? Did his easygoing nature come from me? Or was that all just wishful thinking? Dad, Sophie's voice snapped me out of my daze. I said, forcing a smile. Can you help me with my project later? I need someone who's good at building stuff. Of course, I said, relieved for the brief moment of normalcy. Just let me know when. Emma stood by the sink, her back to us, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. Jack glanced at her, then back at me. Everything okay? He asked, his brow furrowing. Yeah, I said quickly. Too quickly. Just a lot on my mind. Jack shrugged and went back to eating, but I could feel Emma's shoulders tense. She knew I was barely keeping it together. Once the kids were out the door, Jack heading to school and Sophie catching her bus, I turned to Emma. We need to talk about how to handle this, I said, keeping my voice low. I know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But please not here. Not now. I stared at her for a long moment, my jaw tight. Fine. But this conversation isn't going away, Emma. Not this time. She nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes fixed on the floor. I spent the day at work trying to focus but failing miserably. My mind kept looping back to the DNA test, the letters, and the image of Jack looking up to me as if I were the only father he'd ever known, because I was. By the time I got home, the kids were both in their rooms, and Emma was sitting in the living room, waiting. Let's do this, I said, sinking into the armchair across from her. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her face pale. Where do we even start? How about with the truth? I shot back. She flinched but nodded. It happened once, just once, and I regretted it immediately. David and I was stupid. It was a weak moment. I was frustrated with us. You were working so much and I felt alone. He was there, and it just happened. I clenched my fists trying to stay calm, and you never thought to tell me? Not once in 16 years. Tears welled in her eyes. What was I supposed to say? Hey, by the way, I cheated on you, and there's a chance the baby isn't yours? I couldn't do that to you. To us. But you could let me raise another man's child? I snapped. You're his father, she said fiercely. Not David. You've been there for him every step of the way. That's what matters. I shook my head, laughing bitterly. What matters is that you lied. You robbed me of the chance to decide for myself if I could forgive you, if I could live with it. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I stood, pacing the room. Does David know? She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. He knows, doesn't he? I said, my voice rising. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, he knows. But he agreed it was best for everyone if we didn't say anything. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. How noble of him. Let me guess, you two decided it was better for me to live a lie while he watched from the sidelines? It wasn't like that, she said desperately. He stayed away. He's never tried to be a part of Jack's life. Lucky him, I spat. He gets to be the coward who screwed my wife and left me to clean up the mess. Emma's sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. Not now. We're telling Jack, I said finally. Her head shot up, her eyes wide. No, you can't. He deserves to know the truth, Emma. He's 16. He can handle it. He's our son, she pleaded. He'll hate me. He'll hate you for telling him. I turned to face her, my voice cold. He's not my son, and he deserves to know who is. Her sobs echoed in the room as I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I wasn't sure how I was going to do it, but one thing was certain. Jack had to know. The next day, I woke up early, consumed by restless energy. I barely slept, my mind racing with questions about how to tell Jack. What could I say? How could I even begin to explain something so monumental without breaking him or making him resent me forever? Emma barely spoke as we moved around the kitchen. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face pale, and she hadn't even touched her coffee. I didn't care. She'd made this mess. I was just trying to find a way through it. When Jack came downstairs, cheerful as always, the weight of what I was about to do hit me like a freight train. "Morning, Dad," he said, grabbing a slice of toast and stuffing it into his mouth. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound normal. "Hey, Jack," I said after a moment. "You have time to talk before school?" He frowned, glancing at the clock. I guess. What's up?" Emma shot me a panicked look, but I ignored her. "Come with me," I said, motioning toward the living room. Jack followed, looking puzzled. He plopped down on the couch, still munching on his toast. "What's going on? Did I do something wrong?" I sat across from him, my heart pounding. "No, Jack, you didn't do anything wrong. But there's something I need to tell you. Something important." His brow furrowed. "Okay." I hesitated, searching for the right words. How do you tell a teenager that his entire sense of identity is about to be shattered? "It's about your mom and me," I began, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. Jack sat up straighter, the toast forgotten. "What about you guys? Are you getting a divorce?" "No," I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. "It's not about that. It's about you." "Me?" he said, his confusion deepening. I glanced at Emma, who was standing in the doorway, her face stricken. She shook her head, silently begging me to stop, but it was too late. "Jack," I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes. "I recently found out something I never knew. Something your mom kept from me. And from you." "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tinged with fear. I took a deep breath. "Jack, you're not biologically my son." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Jack stared at me, uncomprehending. "What?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know," I said quickly. "I didn't find out until recently. Your mom, she had an affair, and well, the man she was with is your biological father." Jack looked at Emma, his eyes wide with shock. "Mom, is this true?" Emma stepped into the room, her hands shaking. "Jack, I'm so sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted you to find out like this." "Is it true?" Jack repeated, his voice rising. Emma nodded, sobbing. Jack shot to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You lied to me? My whole life? I didn't mean to hurt you," Emma pleaded. "I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Jack shouted. "By lying? By letting me believe," he broke off, his voice cracking. I stood, reaching out to him. "Jack, I love you. That's never going to change. I've been your father your whole life, and that's what matters." He backed away from me, shaking his head. No, it doesn't. Nothing makes sense now. Nothing." "Jack, please," Emma sobbed. "Who is he?" Jack demanded, his voice trembling. "Who's my real dad?" Neither of us spoke. The room was filled with the sound of Emma's quiet sobs and the ticking of the wall clock. "Tell me," Jack shouted. "It's David," I said finally. He was a friend of ours." Jack's eyes widened, and he looked at me like I was a stranger. "David? Uncle David? Are you kidding me?" I shook my head, my heart breaking at the pain in his voice. "I can't deal with this right now," Jack said, his voice shaking. He stormed out of the room, grabbing his backpack on the way. "Jack!" Emma called after him, but he didn't stop. The front door slammed shut, and the house fell into an awful silence. Emma sank to the floor, sobbing. I stood there, staring at the door, my hands clenched into fists. The truth was out now, but it had come at a cost. A cost I wasn't sure any of us could bear. The hours after Jack stormed out felt endless. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock, counting every minute he was gone. Emma stayed upstairs, shutting herself in the bedroom. Sophie, thankfully, had left for school by then, sparing her from the immediate fallout. When Jack still hadn't returned by mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and headed out. He had to be somewhere, maybe at the soccer field, maybe at his best friend Eric's house. I just needed to find him, to make sure he was safe. I found him at the park, sitting on the bleachers overlooking the soccer field. His backpack was on the ground next to him, and his phone sat forgotten in his lap. He stared out at the empty field, unmoving, his face pale and distant. "Jack," I said softly, walking up the steps. He didn't look at me. "Why are you here?" "To talk," I said, sitting down a few feet away from him. "I don't want to talk." I nodded, giving him space. For a while, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, and the distant sound of kids playing in another part of the park filled the silence. Finally, he broke the quiet. "How long have you known?" "Just a few days," I said. "I found some old letters your mom kept, and I got a test to be sure." He flinched at the mention of the test. "And you decided to just drop it on me like that? In front of her?" "I'm sorry," I said, my voice heavy with regret. "I didn't know how else to do it. You deserve to know the truth." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "The truth? The truth is my whole life is a lie. You're not my dad, and mom's been lying to me for as long as I can remember. How is that fair?" "You're right," I admitted. "It's not fair. None of this is fair. But listen to me, Jack. Biological or not, you're my son. I've been there for every scraped knee, every late-night project, every soccer game. That doesn't change just because of this." "But it does change," he said, his voice breaking. "It changes everything. I look at you, and now all I can think is, you're not my dad. And then there's David. Uncle David. How do I don't know what to do with that." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "I get it. It's a lot to take in, and I can't tell you how to feel about it. But I'm still here, Jack. I always will be." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes filled with hurt. "Did you know? Before all this? Did you ever suspect?" I shook my head. "Never. Not once. You're my son in every way that mattered. That's all I ever saw." Jack looked away, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her. Or him. You don't have to figure that out today," I said gently. "Or even tomorrow. Take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." We sat there for a while longer, the tension easing ever so slightly. Finally, Jack grabbed his backpack and stood up. "I need some space," he said. "I understand," I replied. "Just let me know you're okay, all right?" He nodded, and I watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared down the path. When I got home, Emma was in the kitchen, staring blankly at the counter. She looked up when I walked in, her face a mask of guilt and exhaustion. "Did you find him?" she asked. "Yes," I said shortly. "He's safe, but he's not ready to come back yet." Emma nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've ruined everything, haven't I?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned against the counter, my mind racing. "You didn't just ruin this for me, Emma. You ruined it for Jack. For everyone. This isn't something that goes away with an apology." Her shoulders sagged, and she covered her face with her hands. I sighed, the anger in me simmering but not boiling over. Right now, all we can do is figure out how to move forward, for Jack's sake, for Sophie's sake. "But you and I, we're not okay. Not even close." Emma nodded, her voice barely audible. "I understand." I left her there, retreating to the living room. The house felt too big, too quiet. And for the first time, I wondered if it would ever feel like home again. The days after Jack left felt like I was moving through a fog. He hadn't come home, but he'd texted me once to let me know he was staying at Eric's house. His message was brief and to the point, but at least I knew where he was and that he was safe. Emma, on the other hand, was a wreck. She spent most of her time in the bedroom, alternating between crying and staring out the window. Sophie had started to notice the tension, her questions growing sharper and harder to deflect. I told her Jack needed space and was staying with a friend, but she wasn't buying it. "Why is Mom acting so weird?" she asked me one evening as we sat at the dinner table. Emma had skipped dinner again, leaving Sophie and me to eat in awkward silence. "She's just going through something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sophie frowned, pushing her food around her plate. "You're lying. Jack's gone, Mom's crying all the time, and you look like you haven't slept in a week. What's going on?" I put my fork down, sighing. I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. She was only 13, and this was too much for her to handle. "Sophie, I promise we'll talk about it when the time is right. But for now, you just have to trust me, okay?" She glared at me, her arms crossed. "I don't get why everyone keeps saying that. If something's wrong, I should know." Her words stung, but I held my ground. I know it's frustrating, I said gently. But this is between your mom, Jack, and me right now. When it's the right time, I'll tell you everything. I promise. Sophie didn't look convinced, but she dropped the subject, retreating to her room with her plate. Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed. It was Jack. Jack, can we meet? Just you and me. I exhaled sharply, relief washing over me. At least he wanted to talk. Me? Of course. Where? Jack, the park. Tomorrow after school. The next afternoon, I waited on the same bleachers where I'd found him before. Jack arrived a few minutes later, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face unreadable. Hey, I said, standing up. Hey, he replied, sitting down without meeting my eyes. I hesitated, unsure of how to start. How have you been? Not great, he said bluntly. But I guess you knew that. I nodded, sitting down beside him. Yeah, I figured. For a while, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us. Finally, Jack spoke. I've been thinking about what you said, he began. About how you're still my dad, even if, he trailed off, staring at the ground. I'm in it, I said softly. He looked at me then, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. Do you still feel the same way about me? After knowing the truth. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Jack, I said, leaning forward, you're my son. That hasn't changed. It never will. I've been there for you your whole life, and I'll keep being there no matter what. DNA doesn't change that. Jack's lip quivered, and he looked away, blinking back tears. I don't know if I can forgive her, he admitted. Or him. I don't blame you, I said. What they did was wrong, and it's okay to be angry about it. He nodded, his jaw tight. But what do I do now? Do I just pretend everything's normal? You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, I said. Take your time. And if you want to ask questions or talk to someone about anything, I'm here. Always. Jack swallowed hard, then finally looked at me. Thanks, Dad. The words weren't said lightly, and I knew then that despite everything, we still had a chance to hold on to what mattered. When we got home, Emma was waiting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. Jack paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, Emma said, her voice breaking. For everything. Jack didn't respond. He just walked past her and up the stairs to his room, the silence cutting through the house like a blade. Emma turned to me, her eyes pleading. What do I do? I shook my head. You wait, and you don't push him. He'll come to you when he's ready. If he's ready. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. For now, it was all we could do, wait, and hope that somehow we could begin to piece together the broken fragments of our family. The idea of testing Sophie hadn't crossed my mind at first. After the truth about Jack, I wanted to believe there was at least one part of my life Emma hadn't lied about. But doubt is a cruel thing. It crept in slowly, whispering in my ear during quiet moments. If Emma had kept one secret for 16 years, what was to say there weren't others? The thought wouldn't let me rest. One morning, as I watched Sophie at the breakfast table, laughing at something on her phone, I caught myself studying her features. The curve of her smile, the color of her eyes. Were they mine, or was I just imagining it? That same day, while Emma was out grocery shopping, I found myself in Sophie's room, looking for something personal, a hairbrush, a toothbrush, anything I could use for a DNA test. It felt wrong, intrusive, but I pushed the guilt aside. I couldn't live with more uncertainty. Her hairbrush sat on her dresser, strands of blonde hair tangled in the bristles. I grabbed it, carefully pulling the hairs into the collection envelope from another DNA test kit I'd picked up. My own sample followed soon after. The wait for the results was agony, but when the email finally came, it was like being hit by a truck all over again. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Sophie was mine. Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by anger. It shouldn't have come to this, testing my own daughter just to be sure. Emma's betrayal had poisoned everything. That night, I told Emma I wanted to talk. We sat in the living room, the tension between us so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. I tested Sophie. I said, skipping any preamble. Her face went pale. You what? I had to know. I said bluntly. After everything with Jack, I couldn't just assume anymore. Tears filled her eyes, and she clutched the arm of the couch. And she's mine, I said, the words heavy with both relief and bitterness. But the fact that I even had to check says everything about where we are. Emma buried her face in her hands, sobbing. I've destroyed everything, she whispered. I leaned forward, my voice low and calm. Yes, you have. And I can't keep doing this, Emma. I can't keep living in a house full of lies and pretending we're okay. Her head shot up, panic flashing across her face. What are you saying? I'm saying I want a divorce, I said firmly. She gasped, shaking her head. No, please, we can work through this. We can fix it. There's no fixing this, I said. You lied to me for 16 years. You let me build my life on something that wasn't real. And now, Jack's life is torn apart too. I can't forgive that. Emma reached for me, but I pulled back. Please, she begged, her voice breaking. Don't do this to Sophie. Don't do this to Jack. We can make this right. I'm not doing this to them, I said coldly. You did, and I'll make sure they're okay. I'll always be there for them. But I'm done with you, Emma. I'm done living a lie. Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not this time. The next day, I called a lawyer. Divorce wasn't something I'd ever thought I'd have to consider, but now it felt like the only way forward. My focus was clear. Protect Jack and Sophie, make the process as smooth as possible for their sake, and ensure Emma couldn't spin this into something else. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I laid everything out. The affair, the letters, the DNA tests, it all spilled out like poison. I want joint custody of both kids, I said firmly. The lawyer nodded, taking notes. Given the situation, that shouldn't be an issue. But are you prepared for how contentious this might get? Divorces with infidelity involved can get ugly. I exhaled, leaning back in the chair. I'll do whatever it takes to protect my kids. I won't let this turn into a circus, but I won't back down either. The lawyer nodded. Then we'll proceed carefully. But you should prepare for the possibility that this could be drawn out. When I got home, Emma was sitting in the kitchen, her eyes swollen and red. She looked up as I walked in, the tension palpable. I called a lawyer, I said simply. Her face crumbled, but she nodded. I figured you would. I want to do this as amicably as possible, I said. For the kids. But make no mistake, Emma, this is happening. She didn't argue, just nodded again, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. As I walked away, I felt the weight of the decision settle in. The life I'd known for so long was over, and what came next was uncertain. But one thing was clear. I wouldn't let Emma's choices define my future or my kids. The days after my announcement to Emma were tense, the house heavy with unspoken words. Sophie had started noticing the distance between us more acutely, her questions growing sharper. Jack, while back home, kept his interactions brief and his emotions guarded. Emma had moved into the guest room, a quiet acknowledgement that the cracks between us had grown into an unbridgeable chasm. She tried to act normal around the kids, but every attempt at a smile or casual conversation only emphasized the strain. One evening, as Sophie was working on a school project at the dining table, she glanced up at me. Dad, what's going on with you and Mom? I froze mid-step, the weight of her question pressing down on me. What do you mean? I asked, trying to buy time. She put down her pen, her eyes narrowing. You're barely talking to each other, and Jack's been acting weird for days. Don't lie to me. I'm not a little kid. I sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. Sophie, this is complicated. Your mom and I are going through something right now. It doesn't mean we don't love you or Jack. But you're getting a divorce, aren't you? She asked bluntly, her voice tinged with both fear and defiance. My heart sank. We're working through what's best for the family, I said carefully. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't look away. Why? What happened? I hesitated, torn between protecting her innocence and respecting her growing maturity. There are things between your mom and me that can't be fixed, but it doesn't change how much we both love you and Jack. That will never change. Sophie nodded slowly, wiping at her eyes. I just don't want us to stop being a family. We'll always be a family, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. No matter what. The next hurdle was Jack. He had been avoiding Emma as much as possible, retreating to his room or spending time at Eric's house. I knew I couldn't push him, but I also couldn't let him carry his anger alone. One Saturday, I knocked on his door and waited. Yeah, came his muffled response. I opened the door cautiously. Jack was sprawled on his bed, headphones on, but he took them off when he saw me. Hey, I said, stepping inside. Got a minute? He shrugged, sitting up. I sat in his desk chair, spinning it slightly to face him. I know things have been rough lately, I began. He scoffed. That's an understatement. I nodded, letting the comment hang. You're angry, and you have every right to be. What your mom did, it wasn't fair to any of us. But I need you to know something, Jack. This divorce? It's not your fault, or Sophie's. It's between me and your mom, and nothing you or your sister did caused it. Jack looked down, fiddling with the strings on his hoodie. It still feels like everything's falling apart. I know, I said softly, and I'm sorry for that. But we're going to get through this. I promise. It's just going to take time. He nodded, his face tight with emotion. I don't know if I can ever forgive her. Or him. You don't have to decide that right now, I said. Take it one day at a time. And if you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here. Jack didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. Meanwhile, the divorce process had officially begun. My lawyer had filed the initial paperwork, and Emma had received notice. We agreed to mediation rather than a contentious court battle, mostly for the kids' sake. One night, after the kids were asleep, Emma knocked softly on my office door. Can we talk? She asked, stepping inside before I could answer. I leaned back in my chair, watching her carefully. What is it? She hesitated, wringing her hands. I want to say thank you for not making this harder than it already is, for thinking about the kids first. I nodded, my expression neutral. They're my priority. Always. She sat down across from me, her eyes filled with regret. I know I can't fix what I've done, but I want you to know. I'm sorry. For all of it. I didn't respond immediately. Finally, I said, it's going to take a long time to untangle everything you've done, Emma. I'll co-parent with you, and I'll make sure the kids are okay. But forgiveness? I don't know if I'll ever get there. Tears filled her eyes, but she nodded. I understand. As she left the room, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The end of one chapter was finally within sight, but it had come at a cost I never anticipated. All that mattered now was making sure Jack and Sophie came through it as unscathed as possible, and finding a way to rebuild my own life from the ashes. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.